The morning Trisha Blackwell almost died, she had on her good heels. Not because she had anywhere special to be, not because there was a meeting she needed to impress anyone in, or a lunch that required her to look a certain way. Just because after 2 years of grief, 2 years of learning how to be a widow and a mother and a professional all at once, of putting herself back together in the dark when her children were asleep and couldn't see her fall apart, she had made a quiet decision that small things mattered. The way her coffee smelled first thing in the morning, the sound of her kids arguing over the remote control like the world wasn't heavy at all, the satisfying, deliberate click of good heels on a sidewalk that said, without words, "I am still here. I am still standing. Whatever came at me, I am still standing." She never made it to the sidewalk. Trisha was 28 years old, and she had already lived more than most people twice her age. Senior financial analyst at Meridian Capital Group, one of the most quietly powerful investment firms in downtown Atlanta. The kind of place where people wore their ambition like a second suit and smiled at you with one eye always on the door. She had walked into that building as a junior associate at 23, fresh out of Spelman, hungrier than she let anyone see. She had learned fast, moved faster, and by the time her husband Deshaun passed, a heart condition nobody knew about, gone in a Tuesday afternoon that started like any other, she had already built enough of a reputation that nobody dared treat her like she was fragile. She was not fragile. She was Trisha Blackwell. A smooth dark skin and sharp cheekbones and eyes that moved through a room like they were cataloguing everything, missing nothing. The kind of beautiful that didn't ask for your attention but got it anyway. The kind of woman who made people want to earn her smile because she didn't hand it out for free. But none of that, not the career, not the composure, not the heels, none of it was the center of her life. Marcus was 8, curious in a way that exhausted and delighted her simultaneously. He asked things like, "Why do we dream, and do fish know they're wet? And Mum, what did Dad smell like? I'm starting to forget." That last one had almost broken her in the cereal aisle of a Kroger on a Wednesday evening 6 months ago. She had held it together until she got to the car. Then she had sat in the parking lot and let herself cry for exactly 11 minutes because she had learned in the brutal education of grief that you had to give sorrow its time or it would take more than you offered. Nia was 5, round-cheeked and endlessly, almost aggressively affectionate. She believed with the complete conviction of a child that hugs solved most problems. That pink was a neutral colour that went with everything, and that her mother was the most powerful person on earth. Trisha was working hard not to disappoint that last belief. They were her reason. For the heels, for the early mornings, for all of it. And they were the reason that rainy Thursday, when her instincts told her something was wrong, she listened. It had started, like most things she hadn't seen coming, with a phone call. She was in the kitchen, pouring coffee, half listening to the morning news while Nia ate toast with more butter than was strictly necessary, and Marcus read something at the table the way he always did, like the world could wait. Her phone buzzed. David Marsh. She picked up. "Hey." His voice came through, and already something about it was slightly off. Too measured. Too casual in the way people get when they're working to sound casual. "Did you finalize the Eastbridge file?" "Sent it last night," she said, glancing toward her laptop on the counter. "Around 9. Silence. Not long, but long enough. "Just wanted to double-check. Big clients, you know how it is." "I know how it is," she said slowly. "Is there a problem with it?" No, just being thorough. You know me." She did know him. That was the thing. She had worked alongside David Marsh for 3 years. Sat across from him in strategy meetings, covered for him twice when he missed deadlines he couldn't explain. She knew the rhythm of how he spoke, the tells he didn't know he had, and something in this call was pulling at a thread she hadn't known was loose. "Okay," she said. "Let me know if you need anything else." She hung up and stood with her coffee mug held in both hands, staring at nothing. David had been different for weeks. She had been tracking it the way she tracked everything. Quietly, without making it obvious. The way he positioned himself in the office so he could see her desk. The questions that were almost about work but not quite. The time she'd come back from the bathroom and found him standing near her computer in a way that had no good explanation. She had told herself it was nothing. She had told herself she was projecting because grief had made her hypervigilant, had turned her nervous system into something that fired too easily. She had almost convinced herself. She gathered the children, helped Nia into her jacket, reminded Marcus 3 times to put his book down, and headed for the door. The rain was steady and grey, the kind that settles into a city and makes everything feel muffled. She stepped out of her building with Nia's hand wrapped in hers, and Marcus close at her side, her bag on her shoulder, her keys between her fingers the way Deshawn had taught her years ago. Just in case, Trish. Just in case. She saw it before she understood what she was seeing. Black SUV, parked directly across the street. Engine running, which nobody does in the rain just to sit. Windows tinted dark enough that you couldn't see in, but light enough that whoever was inside could see out perfectly. It had been there yesterday too, she realized. She had clocked it and filed it away and told herself it was nothing. It wasn't nothing. Every fine hair on her body stood up at once. She kept moving, kept her face neutral. Squeezed Nia's hand once, twice. Looked down at Marcus and put her hand on his shoulder. A touch that meant stay close without saying it out loud. And that is the moment everything came apart. Now, before this story goes where it's about to go, if your heart is already beating a little faster, if you're already leaning in, then you are exactly the kind of person City of Tales was built for. Subscribe right now. Hit the bell. Because stories like this one drop every single week. And you do not want to be the person who finds out about it 3 episodes too late. Subscribe to City of Tales. We'll be right here when you come back, down the block, tucked into the shadow of a building, a different car sat in the rain. Longer. Darker. The kind of vehicle that didn't draw attention because it was designed not to. Inside, Jun Woo watched the SUV. He was 34 years old and had lived in the margins of legal society for long enough that danger no longer registered as danger. It registered as information. A body language here. A small behavioral inconsistency there. His mind was a very clean, very cold instrument, and he had spent the better part of his adult life sharpening it. He had come to Atlanta for business. That was the clean version. Sir, the longer version involved money, significant money, moving through a network of shell companies and investment vehicles and, somewhere in the chain, Meridian Capital Group, whose compliance team had begun asking questions that nobody was supposed to ask. He wasn't there to hurt anyone. He was there to understand the exposure and manage it quietly, the way his organization had always managed things. He had not expected to find himself watching a woman and her children, but 3 days of surveillance that was supposed to be about financial architecture, about paper trails and partner networks, had introduced him to Trisha Blackwell. And something about the way she moved through the world had made him keep watching past the point where it was professionally necessary. She was remarkable, was the thing. And not just the obvious. And yes, it was obvious he wasn't blind, but the way she existed, the way she managed 2 children and a demanding career and the clearly visible weight of recent loss without any of it breaking her posture. She moved through her days like someone who had decided, at some fundamental level, that the world was not going to win. He had found that interesting. He was reconsidering that word now as he watched the man in the SUV's passenger seat shift forward. Those aren't corporate security, Jun Woo said, in Korean mostly to himself. His driver, a man named Seo who had been with him for 8 years and knew better than to ask unnecessary questions, glanced up at the rearview mirror. Jun Woo's eyes moved from the SUV to Trisha. She had already seen it. He could tell by the precise, controlled way she was pretending she hadn't, the slight adjustment of her grip on her daughter's hand, the way she'd repositioned Marcus. She was smart enough to clock the threat and calm enough not to telegraph that she had. But smart and calm were not going to be enough for what was about to happen. The driver's side door of the SUV opened. "Stay," Jun Wu said to Seo. He was already reaching for the door. The man who stepped out of the SUV was not trying to hide what he was. That was always the tell, when they stopped pretending. He moved with the flat, purposeful energy of someone who had already made their decision and was simply executing it. His hand brushed the inside of his coat. Trisha saw it. She went very still for exactly 1 second, the second it takes a sharp mind to process the unthinkable. And then she did the thing that later Jun Woo would think about more than almost anything else from that morning. She didn't run. She crouched down, took Marcus by both shoulders, looked him directly in the eyes, and spoke to him in a voice so quiet and so controlled that Jun Woo, 40 feet away, could not hear a word of it. He didn't need to. He watched Marcus grab his sister's hand and bolt back toward the building entrance without a second of hesitation, and he understood that whatever Trisha had said, she had said it in a way that got through. That was a mother who had prepared her children on some level for the possibility of emergency. That was a woman who had thought about contingencies. That was also a woman now standing alone on a wet Atlanta sidewalk with 2 armed men converging on her and no exit. The first shot fractured the morning. Glass exploded somewhere above and behind her. A storefront window, destroyed by a bullet that missed. People on the sidewalk screamed. A woman with a stroller reversed hard and ran. A man in a delivery uniform dropped everything and pressed himself against the nearest wall. The city, which had been going about its ordinary rainy Thursday, suddenly had no idea what to do with itself. Trisha hit the ground. Good instincts. She pressed herself flat against the pavement and covered her head, and the second shot went wide, clipping a parking meter in a shriek of metal. The man from the SUV was still moving, not running, walking, deliberate. That was when the third shot happened. Except it didn't come from him. He went down, not dead, but down, clutching his shoulder, the weapon skittering across wet pavement. Trisha looked up. Jun Woo stood in the middle of the sidewalk with the same energy he brought to everything. Contained, precise. Like firing a weapon in the middle of a public Atlanta street was simply a thing that sometimes needed doing. The second man from the SUV had his weapon up, and Jun Woo moved, not away, but laterally, positioning himself between the shooter and Trisha with a fluidity that spoke to years of physical training, and returned fire twice. The second man went down behind a parked car, wounded, no longer a threat. In the space of about 11 seconds, everything had changed. Jun Woo looked down at Trisha. She was looking up at him, chest heaving. Rain soaking through her good coat, mascara beginning to trace lines down her face that she would have hated if she'd known about them. Her expression wasn't what he expected. It wasn't pure fear. It was something more complex. Fury mixed with calculation, already trying to understand what had just happened and who this man was and what it meant. "Get up," he said. Her eyes narrowed slightly, like she was deciding whether to argue. She got up. They moved fast. The second attacker from behind the car fired twice more, wild shots, a wounded man panicking. And Jun Woo kept his body angled between the gunfire and Trisha, guiding her with a hand on her arm that was firm without being rough. Seo had the car moving before they fully reached it. The door opened, she got in. Jun Woo followed. The door closed. The Atlanta skyline blurred and receded through the rain-streaked windows. For a moment, the only sounds were the engine and their breathing. Then Trisha said, "My children," not a question, not a plea, a statement that contained an entire world of consequence. "They're safe," Jun Woo said. He was looking straight ahead. "I had people outside your building. They're already secured." She turned to look at him fully for the first time. Really, look. He was not what she had expected, though she couldn't have said in that moment what she had expected. Sharp features, dark eyes that missed nothing, a suit that had somehow survived a gunfight without visible disorder. He was younger than she'd have guessed for someone who moved the way he did. And he was watching the road with the focused calm of someone whose nervous system had simply never learned to panic. "You had people outside my building," she repeated. Yes. You were watching me? Yes. That's supposed to comfort me? He glanced at her then. Something almost imperceptible moved at the corner of his mouth. You're alive, he said. She held his gaze for a long moment. She could feel the adrenaline beginning to metabolize, that specific crash of a body coming down from terror, the shaking that starts in your hands and moves inward. She pressed her palms flat against her thighs and breathed through it. One breath, then another, the way she'd taught herself to do it, the way she'd learned you had to when your life stopped giving you the luxury of falling apart. Where are we going? She asked. Somewhere safe. That's not an answer. It's the only one I have right now. She turned back to the window and watched Atlanta slide past, wet and ordinary and completely unaware of what had just happened in its streets. Somewhere in that city, her children were being carried to safety by men who worked for a stranger whose name she didn't even know yet. She filed that away. She would deal with it. Right now, she was dealing with the fact that she was still breathing. The penthouse was on the 34th floor of a building in Midtown that looked, from the outside, like any other upscale residential tower. Inside, it was a different kind of place entirely. Clean and spare, all glass and dark wood and the kind of quiet that costs money. Not ostentatious, just utterly, completely controlled. Like the man who used it. But Marcus and Nia were already there when she arrived, sitting on a large cream-coloured sofa with a woman Trisha didn't know. Late 20s, Asian, hair pulled back, watching them with the professional attentiveness of someone trained in exactly this kind of situation. Nia had fallen asleep against the sofa cushions. Marcus looked up when Trisha came through the door, and the expression on his face, the relief, the held breath releasing, nearly undid her entirely. She crossed the room in 4 steps and pulled him into her arms and held him for a long time without saying anything. Then she gently transferred Nia to the bedroom the woman showed her to, tucked her in, stood in the doorway watching her daughter sleep for a moment. When she came back out, Jun Woo was standing near the windows. The rain had lightened slightly. The city below them reduced to blurred lights and the sound of distant traffic. She walked to the opposite side of the room, put space between them on purpose, and crossed her arms. Start talking, she said. He turned to face her, leaned back slightly against the window frame, the city a backdrop behind him. You were targeted deliberately, he said. This wasn't opportunistic. Whoever sent those men knew your address, your routine, the time you leave with your children. This was planned, and it was planned by someone with access to the details of your life. Trisha's jaw tightened. Your firm has been involved in some financial activity that intersects with certain interests I represent, he continued. I came to Atlanta to understand that intersection. In the course of doing so, I became aware that someone within your firm is engaged in activity that has nothing to do with me and everything to do with you personally. She stared at him. You were running surveillance on Meridian. Yes. On me specifically? A slight pause. Initially on the firm. You became relevant because you were the one asking the right questions. The Eastbridge file. She had flagged 3 anomalies in that file. 3 places where the numbers folded back on themselves in ways that were subtle enough that most analysts would have walked past them. She hadn't walked past them. She had documented them and prepared to take them to compliance. And then David had called. The cold moved through her slowly, starting in her chest. David. 3 years. 3 years of working alongside him, of covering for him, and of genuinely believing that whatever his shortcomings were, he was on her side. She thought about the times he'd offered to help with her caseload after Deshawn died. She thought about the birthday cards signed with what she had taken for warmth. She thought about every question he'd asked her in the past 6 weeks, disguised as collegiality, actually as reconnaissance. Someone close to you, Jun Woo said quietly. She didn't answer. She didn't need to. The look on her face said it. He watched her with an expression she couldn't fully read. Not pity. She would have hated that. Something more like recognition. The look of someone who understood what it felt like to discover that your read on a person was entirely wrong. What are they protecting? She asked. Money, he said. A significant amount of it. Her moving through accounts that Eastbridge is connected to. Whoever is behind it has been careful, but you found the thread. And now they want to pull it, she said, by getting rid of me. He didn't contradict her. She stood there in this stranger's penthouse in the middle of a Thursday that had already contained more than most years, and she let herself feel the full weight of it for exactly as long as she could afford to, which wasn't long. Then she lifted her chin. What do you need from me? He was quiet for a moment. Patience, he said, and trust, both of which I understand I have not yet earned. She looked at him, this composed, contained, dangerous man who had walked into gunfire without hesitation to get in between her and the thing that wanted to hurt her. You're right, she said. You haven't. She went to check on her children. The days that followed existed in a suspended, strange kind of time. Jun Woo's world ran on systems, routines, protocols, hierarchies, the kind of order that danger necessitates. His people moved quietly through the penthouse, spoke in low voices, gave Trisha more space than she expected. He had clearly told them to. She established her own routine within the strange new shape of her days. Mornings with the children, breakfast, Marcus's questions, Nia's elaborate imaginary games that somehow always required Trisha to play a queen under siege, which, given the circumstances, felt less like play than it once had. Afternoons she spent on her laptop, working through what she knew about Eastbridge, building the picture. She was not the kind of woman who waited for someone else to solve her problem. Jun Woo noticed. He didn't say so, not directly. But she would look up sometimes and find him watching her with an expression that had something careful in it, not the flat professional assessment she'd seen from him in those first hours. Something else. Something he seemed to be working to keep neutral. She didn't push it. She had enough to carry. But the evenings were harder to manage. After the children were asleep and the city settled into its nighttime frequencies, there was less to do with the awareness that accumulated in shared space. Jun Woo was not a man who filled silence unnecessarily. She was not a woman who needed it filled. They had both spent enough of their lives in high-pressure environments to know that silence didn't have to be uncomfortable. It was on the fourth evening that things shifted. She had taken a glass of water out to the balcony, a wide, rain-cleared stretch of space with the Atlanta skyline spread below like a circuit board lit for the night. She stood there for a while, not thinking about anything specific, which was a luxury she rarely allowed herself and only ever found by accident. She heard the door slide open behind her. Jun Woo came to stand a few feet to her left, forearms resting on the railing looking out at the same city. They stood like that for a while. You saved my life, she said eventually. Yes? She glanced at him. Most people would have let that sentence breathe a little longer before agreeing. Something shifted in his face. It might, she thought, have been the beginning of a smile. You stated a fact, I confirmed it. Do you do anything without a reason? No. She turned slightly toward him. So what was yours? For that morning, you didn't have to get involved? Whatever your business was with my firm, it didn't require you to walk into a gunfight. He was quiet for a moment, long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then he turned to look at her, and his eyes were very direct, the way they always were, but with something open in them that she hadn't seen before. You, he said. Just that word. Nothing decorated around it, no performance, just the plain truth of it, offered without apparent strategy. She felt it land somewhere deep and inconvenient. She had built walls after Deshawn, not because she was afraid of love. She understood love, believed in it, had felt it in its fullest form. She had built walls because she was afraid of need, of leaning on something that could be taken, of looking at a person and thinking I couldn't survive losing this, because she already knew with her whole body exactly how that felt. But this man, this impossible, controlled, dangerous, precise man, was looking at her like she was the only fixed point in a world that was otherwise entirely in motion. She didn't overthink it. She didn't talk herself out of it or into it. She just let herself be present for once, in the space between what was smart and what was real, and she closed the distance. The kiss started the way he seemed to do everything. Careful, deliberate, with the quality of attention that made you feel like you were the only thing in the room. Then it became something else, something warmer and less controlled and more human. Two people who had both spent a long time being very strong, finding for a moment that they didn't have to be. When they separated, the city was still there below them, indifferent and glittering. Neither of them said anything. Neither of them needed to. But David Marsh was still out there. Jun Woo hadn't forgotten that. He was not a man who forgot things. The morning after the balcony, he was on the phone before Trisha woke up, standing in the corner of the main room with his voice very quiet and very precise. "I want everything on Marsh," he said. "Every account, every contact. Every meeting for the past 18 months. I want to know who he's working for, how long it's been going on, and what exactly he believed he was protecting." "We could move on him now," his lieutenant said through the phone. "We know where he is." "No. Why wait?" Jun Woo's eyes moved to the closed bedroom door behind which Trisha's children were still sleeping. "Because she deserves to know the full truth," he said. "Not just that it happened. Why it happened. Who decided her life was expendable. She needs the whole picture. So do I." He hung up. Across Atlanta, in an apartment that smelled like takeout and stale ambition, David Marsh sat in front of two monitors displaying a mixture of financial data and personal information he had spent months collecting. He had a glass of whiskey he wasn't drinking. He had a phone that hadn't rung in 36 hours, which was a problem, because it was supposed to have rung to confirm that the job was done. Instead, there had been nothing. He pulled up a news search. Nothing about the incident had made the papers, which meant either it had been cleaned up extremely effectively or it had failed extremely quietly. Neither option was reassuring. He looked at the photo he had printed of Trisha and the kids, tacked to the board above his second monitor. He had done that the way you build a target, not with hatred exactly, but with the necessary detachment that comes from reducing a person to a problem that needs solving. He had almost managed it. But the fact that his phone hadn't rung meant the problem was still unsolved. He reached for his whiskey. He smiled. Because that was how he processed things that made him afraid. And somewhere between that smile and the next morning's light, he began to make new plans. Trisha found out about Jun Woo's call later that day, not because he told her, but because she asked. She had made clear from the beginning that she was not a passenger in her own crisis, and he had, to his credit, stopped trying to manage what she knew. She sat across from him at the dining table, with her laptop open to the Eastbridge documentation she had been rebuilding from memory. And she listened as he walked her through what his team had assembled about David in the past 24 hours. It was worse than she had imagined, not because of the scale, though the scale was significant, as several $1 million in commission skimming and account manipulation across 14 months, but because of the timeline. It had started 9 months after Deshawn died, when she had been at her lowest, least vigilant, most distracted, when she had been relying more than she should have on the people around her at work. He had started then, deliberately, knowing she was vulnerable. She sat very still through all of it. Jun Woo watched her the way he always watched her, completely, attentively, without filling the space. When he finished, she closed her laptop. "He used my grief," she said. "Yes. He watched me go through the worst year of my life and decided it was an opportunity." "Yes." She nodded slowly as though processing something very far down. "I want to be in the room when this ends," she said. And he held her gaze. "I know," he said. "I'm not asking your permission, I'm telling you." A beat. "I know that too," he said. She looked at him for a moment, and something between them settled into a new configuration. Not softer exactly, but more honest, more equal. Two people who had both spent their lives being the person who handled things, recognizing that quality in each other and deciding carefully that it might be a foundation rather than a conflict. The plan came together over the next 48 hours. It was not a complicated plan. The best ones rarely were. David believed by now that either Trisha was dead and the evidence had been handled, or she had run and gone quiet. Either way, he believed himself temporarily safe enough to move the remaining funds, complete the transaction that Eastbridge had been building toward, and tie off the ends. Jun Woo's team watched him make those preparations. Let him. The financial transfer David was planning would, once initiated, create a paper trail that connected not just David, but the entire network above him, the people who had commissioned him, the accounts they operated through, the entities they hid behind. Trisha had spent 2 full days reconstructing and annotating the Eastbridge documentation with the kind of forensic precision that made Jun Woo's financial people visibly impressed. What she was building was not just evidence of what David had done. It was a complete picture of the structure he served. She was going to burn the whole thing down. On the night it happened, she stood in the front room of the penthouse while Jun Woo's team coordinated across 3 different locations. She was not in the physical room where David was confronted. Jun Woo had drawn one line, exactly one, and it was that she would not be present for the moment that was most dangerous, and she had accepted that boundary because it was the one he was not going to move on, and she had learned in the compressed intimacy of the past week to understand the difference between his control and his care. She was on the phone with the SEC contact Jun Woo had connected her with when she heard the confirmation come through from his team. David was in custody, not Jun Woo's custody. The arrangement had been, through channels she only partially understood, that the evidence package Trisha had built would reach federal authorities through a conduit that had no fingerprints on it from Jun Woo's organization. David would face prosecution. The network above him would be unraveled by people with subpoena power. And Trisha would remain exactly what she was. A woman who had found the thread and pulled it. She stood at the window. She kept coming back to windows, she noticed, as though she needed to keep checking that the city was still there. And she breathed out very slowly. Marcus appeared at her elbow, still in his pajamas, having apparently concluded that his bedtime was negotiable. "Is it over?" he asked. He was 8. He understood more than she would have liked. She looked down at him. Part of it, she said honestly. Because she was Trisha Blackwell, and she did not lie to her children about how complicated things were. He leaned against her side. She put her arm around him. Nia appeared 3 seconds later because Nia had a radar for moments that required her presence and attached herself firmly to Trisha's other side. They stood there, the 3 of them, watching Atlanta from 34 floors up. Jun Woo came in a few minutes later. He stopped when he saw them at the window. Something moved across his face that he made no effort to control. He stood there for a moment just inside the doorway, taking in the picture they made, and Trisha saw it happen. Saw the carefully maintained distance of him begin almost imperceptibly to give way to something warmer and less armored. But she met his eyes over the tops of her children's heads. He walked to the window and stood beside her. "It's handled," he said quietly. "I know." Marcus looked up at him with the assessment of a child who has been evaluating this particular adult for several days. "Are you staying?" he asked. The directness of it. Trisha felt herself hold her breath. Jun Woo looked down at Marcus for a moment, then he looked at Trisha. "That," he said carefully, "is not my decision." Marcus looked at his mother. Trisha looked at Jun Woo. And the city spread out below them, enormous and indifferent and full of the next thing, the thing that none of them could see yet, the story that was already writing itself in the streets below while they stood here figuring out how to begin. David was in custody. The network was exposed. Her children were safe. But Jun Woo's world did not end when a problem was solved. His world moved continuously from one set of dangerous coordinates to the next. She understood that now. And somewhere in the past week, she had also come to understand that she was not a woman who needed safety to mean the absence of danger. She had never had that. She had built her life in the space between what was hard and what was possible, and she had never once needed the world to be simple. She needed it to be real. What was happening between her and this man was very, very real. What it would cost, where it would lead, what it would mean for her children and her life, and the careful structure she had rebuilt from grief. Those were questions she didn't have answers to yet. But Trisha Blackwell had never been afraid of questions. Or she had always been more afraid of the ones she never asked. She turned from the window. "Stay for dinner," she said. It was not a declaration. It was not a promise. It was an open door, which was all she had to offer and, she suspected, all he needed. Jun Woo's expression shifted into something that was, unmistakably, a smile. Small. Real. "Yes," he said. Outside, Atlanta moved through its night, full of 1,000 stories in progress. Full of danger and love and money and grief and the particular courage it takes to keep choosing to be present in your own life, even when your life has shown you exactly how fast it can change. Trisha's story was not over. It had, in the truest sense, barely started. And somewhere in the city below, in a thread of that network that had not yet been fully unraveled, someone was reading the news about David Marsh's arrest with an expression that did not look surprised, did not look afraid, looked instead like a person recalculating, like a person who had been in this position before, like a person who had a next move already prepared. The real war had not ended. It had simply entered its next phase. And Trisha, who had rebuilt herself from loss, who had found something real in an impossible place, who had never once stopped fighting, was already, without knowing it, standing at the edge of the chapter that would demand more of her than anything that had come before. This was only part 1. City of Tales. Subscribe. Because the best part is always what comes next.